Hello, we're going to continue our study of ecosystems, and today our focus is going to be on the ways that different organisms get their food energy. So first of all, there are the producers. Now, the producers are great organisms because they actually produce their own food. And remember, in our study of photosynthesis, they're the ones that take the radiant energy from the sun and convert it into chemical energy, our food, through the process of photosynthesis. So they're definitely important characters in our ecosystems. Okay, some examples of producers, which are also called autotrophs, would be plants, of course, kelp, different kinds of seaweed, and even some bacteria, cyanobacteria, they have chlorophyll and they're able to do photosynthesis. Okay, so producers, they make their own food, and they're also called autotrophs. The other group are the consumers, and consumers are organisms that get their food by consuming or eating other organisms, and they're also called heterotrophs. So we have the autotrophs that are producers, heterotrophs that are consumers. And there are a lot of different types of consumers. So we're going to begin talking about detritivores and decomposers. Now, a lot of people clump these all together, which is fine, but there is a distinction. The decomposers are the organisms that actually break down either plant or animal matter and decompose. They break it down into component parts and then feed off that for energy. The detritivores actually just eat dead matter. They don't do any of the decomposing. They just eat what's already there and dead. Okay. Then there are the herbivores. The herbivores are consumers that eat plants or other producers, and we call them primary consumers. And remember, we talked in class about doing the 1 degree as an abbreviation for primary consumer, but the herbivores are the first level or primary consumers. Okay, and they eat only producers, only plants or producers. Then there are the omnivores. They're consumers that eat plants, producers, or other animals, and they're usually primary or secondary consumers, first level or second level consumers. And again, we can use the 1 degree or 2 degree as a shorthand. So some examples of that would be like a pig. Pigs will eat plant matter and also meat. Raccoons. This is a possum down here in the left corner. And then some turtles also are omnivores and will eat some producers, and they'll eat some animals as well. Okay, then there are the carnivores. Carnivores are consumers that eat other animals. They are meat eaters, right? So they are secondary, tertiary, or quaternary consumers, second, third, or fourth level consumers, like this wolf, crocodile. This is a lynx or a bobcat. I'm not quite sure which one. A weasel. So these are all carnivores that are they're consumers that eat other animals. Okay, and then we have our scavengers. They're also consumers, and they eat dead animals usually, but sometimes they'll eat dead plants too. You can see the vultures in the picture here, a hyena that's eating some carcass that's laying on the savanna, and then crows are also scavengers. Before we go on to talk about food webs and all, let's talk about the 2 basic types of ecosystems. There's terrestrial ecosystems, and that is any ecosystem that exists on land, where land is the primary area or region for that ecosystem. And then there are aquatic ecosystems, which are ecosystems that are mainly water. For example, there are 2 main types: marine ecosystems, which are saltwater, and freshwater ecosystems that are freshwater, not saltwater. Okay, so here's another picture. This is a coral reef, not a particularly healthy coral reef. And then here is a river that would be a freshwater ecosystem. Okay, so let's go back to talking about producers and consumers. So we have examples of terrestrial ecosystem food chain here, and we have an aquatic ecosystem example here. So a food chain is just the series of events in an ecosystem in which organisms transfer food energy by eating and being eaten, and that's called a food chain. Okay, so for example here, if you start with a plant, say at the bottom of this terrestrial ecosystem food chain, and then there are insects that feed on that plant, and then there are larger insects that feed on those insects, and then maybe you have a type of frog that eats those insects. And then the frog is eaten by a snake of some kind, and the snake is eaten by a hawk. So that shows that the food energy is traveling from one organism to another, okay? And that's called a food chain. Then in this aquatic ecosystem, you might start out with plankton, some type of producer, which is eaten by these really small organisms, animals, crustaceans, things like that. Those are then eaten by small fish and larger crustaceans like a crab or a shrimp. Then maybe a larger fish will eat some of those smaller fish or crab. Then maybe a porpoise will eat the fish, and then eventually a shark might eat the porpoise. So again, there's the chain of events showing the transfer of food energy. Here are some other examples of terrestrial ecosystems, and you can see that at the beginning of each food chain is a producer. And what comes before the producer? The sun. Okay, so we've got lichen, slug here, a toad, grass snake, but those are some other examples of terrestrial food chains. Okay, one thing about the food chain that's important to remember is that the arrows in the food chain show the direction that the energy is flowing. So this is all about the flow of energy and matter through ecosystems. So if we're starting with the producer got its energy from radiant energy from the sun, and then that energy is passed on to these crustaceans when they feed on the plankton, and then so on it goes through the food chain, and the direction of the arrow shows you the flow of energy. Here's another overall example. It shows radiant energy being used by the producer for photosynthesis, and then that producer is eaten by a primary consumer, and then that consumer is eaten by a secondary consumer, and so on. So you see the food chain here, and the direction of the arrows are very important. Then we talk about ecological pyramids, or sometimes we say trophic pyramids. So the bottom of the pyramid is the biggest level, right? And that's where all of your producers are going to be. 100% of the available energy in that ecosystem is in the bottom level of the pyramid, and that's through the producers. Once those producers are eaten by the primary consumers, that energy passes up the pyramid, but only about 10% of the total energy passes from level to level. So the producers pass on about 10% of their energy when they're eaten by a primary consumer, and then that energy, only about 10% of it is passed on to the secondary consumers, and then only 10% of that is passed on to the tertiary consumers. Now, if we have quaternary consumers, then you can see there's even less energy being passed on. So as you move up the energy pyramid, then you have less and less energy being passed along. So 10% each time. So if we look at this example, the primary, the producers down here at the bottom, trees and flowers and grasses, let's say that they start out with 9,000 kilocalories per square meter per year, okay? So don't worry about all the terms. Just look at the 9,000 kilocalories. So when those producers are eaten by the primary consumers, the herbivores, only 900 kilocalories per square meter per year gets passed on to them. And then they pass on only 90 kilocalories per square meter per year. And then the secondary consumers, when they are eaten by the tertiary consumers, they pass on 9 kilocalories per square meter per year. So we're talking about the area within an ecosystem. So as you get further along the food chain or further up the energy pyramid, there's less available. So you're going to have fewer organisms. The populations are going to be smaller. So you're going to have much fewer bears than you say are going to have squirrels, and you're going to have a lot fewer frogs than you're going to have trees and shrubs and grasses. Okay. So a food chain shows just the one path for the flow of energy. And then a food web is a network of all these food chains that kind of work together in an ecosystem. But again, the arrows are very important. So if you look at the direction that the arrows are pointing, that tells you the direction of the flow of energy. So the tree is passing on energy to the goat. When the goat eats it, the tree is passing energy to the rabbit. And then if you look at some of these, let me find one. Let's see, so here the goat is passing on energy to the jackal, but the goat is also passing on energy to the lion if it's eaten by a lion. So the direction of the arrow tells you where the energy is going. All right, so here's a question that we're going to talk about in class. What happens when the numbers of one population in a food web increase or decrease? So that's a big question. We'll be looking at stability in an ecosystem. Some of our class activities, we'll be looking at the farm ecosystem again. We're going to be looking at different food webs and food chains to look at energy flow. We're going to work, you're going to be doing some work on identifying the producers and consumers and all in your ecosystem. And you'll also be doing another visual, but of a food web in your ecosystem as a step towards your summative project work. All right, so I hope this has been helpful. Have a good day and don't forget to answer all the questions.